Thank you. Excited to have you here.
We're excited.
We're delighted to be here.
So we'll do kind of a conversation, and again, feel free to, we can do, whoever wants to answer the question.
Okay, easy questions in general to me, hard questions to Sheryl.
Okay, I'll go with that. And I hope to leave time for questions from the audience as well. So maybe the most intuitive place to start is your latest project, A Path Appears. I saw and read your previous books, which are a bit more specific, right? Half the Sky, Women Empowerment, your books about China. A Path Appears seems to have a larger scope, more ambitious in the idea that it's giving and donations and charity and social impact in any issue. Is that how you see it?
Well, first of all, let's start with the title, A Path Appears. It comes from a quote by Lucian, who said, "Hope is like a path in the countryside. At first there is nothing. As more people walk back and forth, a path appears." So we thought it was really an apt metaphor for change, that if you throw enough resources and intellectual firepower at an issue, you will find a solution. And so what we did is we looked at some of the pressing problems in the US, also to an extent abroad as well. And inequality was one of the biggest ones. So how do you actually level the playing field? And so we didn't focus on subsidies. That's obviously something that has been around for a while. But what people haven't really focused on is inequality of opportunity. And that's where you really can bring about change, using evidence-based strategies, research that has drawn upon randomized controlled trials, and you can focus on a number of things, including, most importantly, early childhood education.
Right, and it talks about small donors as well. Anyone in the audience that could make a difference, right?
That's right. It arose, frankly, in part because after we would talk about Half the Sky, which is, of course, about empowering women worldwide, and people would come up to us and they'd ask, well, what about the US? What about men? And maybe the most common question was, well, what can I do? And we wanted to address that, not only in terms of donation, but in terms of volunteering and advocacy.
Great. So maybe we'll see a video, if James will roll it for us, from the documentary.
Great.
Because just like Half the Sky, you wrote a book, which is a best-selling book, but then there is a documentary that is following that, right? Following the release of the book.
Yeah.
James, are we cued?
If you can just imagine the documentary right now. There are tremendous differences between poverty in West Virginia and in Canberra or Columbia, but there are some real commonalities as well. Children who were born poor, whether in South Sudan or in West Virginia, aren't going to have the opportunities to surmount those obstacles and rise up the social ladder.
If you suffer trauma as a child, it's something that changes the way your brain grows. If you have the stress of extreme poverty, if you have the stress of abuse, that changes the actual way that your brain grows and develops.
If you're raised in a stressful home, you're going to have long-term outcomes that are going to be less favorable. And that if we want to make a difference, then we need to reach children early. We need to protect them early.
We just have 16 million kids in the United States growing up with these tensions and these stressors. As a country of wealth and abundance, that 1 in 4 kids are growing up in poverty. It's embarrassing. And I promise you, if you hung out with these kids, you would be shocked because they're as smart as your fancy little kids in their fancy little preschools. And I include mine in that. But they're starting school without even a chance of catching up from their first day, and then we have no problem spending money on putting them in jail and keeping them there, but we won't spend the money to give them the right fair start.
So thank you. What's interesting about this project, if you compare it to Half the Sky, is also the focus on the United States. Before that, it was mostly developing countries. Where this came from? You said that people came to you. What about the US?
Well, it was very important for us to also recognize that there were just huge problems here at home that also had some amazing solutions that people really hadn't focused on. Jennifer Gardner talked about early childhood education, how important it is, and it is striking that we are willing to set aside, allocate millions and millions of dollars for jails, but not for early childhood education, partly because kids don't vote.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yet, it's probably the most studied area to focus on the first few years of life. And if you can actually catch the kids early, you can change their trajectory of life and prevent them from ending up in jail.
Right.
And I mean, and issues that we talked about in Half the Sky, like maternal mortality or sex trafficking, there's no doubt that the problems are worse in other countries. We don't really have the moral credibility to tell other countries to improve their act unless we make some attempt right here at home.
So that was part of that. Before we move into media and games, I want to ask you, so it's obviously a tricky question because already you compressed this path into a book, and now we're going to compress it into one question. But is there any kind of way that you can, in a high-level way, define what is that path that appears from this project in terms of giving back and donations?
Well, the path that we focus on is using evidence-based strategies, really, to focus on solutions. And so it's not, let's try this, let's try that. You do need experimentation, but when you actually have floated up to the surface really hardcore research that points to ways to solve problems, let's use them. Now, charities are more and more beginning to try and adopt those, but not that much, not as much as we would like to see. And there's a greater focus on outcomes rather than input. So instead of how much money was raised, how many bags of rice were sent, how many bed nets were sent, it's actually, well, did that rice get to the people who were starving? Were those bed nets used actually for, to prevent malaria? And so that's what the path is. The path is the path towards the solutions for a lot of these challenges.
Is the trend positive, what you're
Oh,
seeing?
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we've made incredible progress, and that's why the World Bank can now say by 2030, and Bill Gates can say by 2030, we want to sort of basically end poverty.
Great. So one thing that I think is very unique to the work you're doing, and it's probably related to enhancing that impact and reach more people, is the fact that this is not only a book. It becomes, with a documentary, with games in the case of Half the Sky, with social media, it's almost like a platform or a movement. Is this how you're going to continue doing this?
Well, in a sense, if you want to have impact, then you can't think just about one platform. You have to almost be a little agnostic about the platform and go to where people are. And one of the challenges with a book is that, in general, the people who buy and read a book are those who already agree with you. Right. And if you don't just want to preach to the choir, but you want to expand the choir, then you have to go out and drag in more people. And I suppose one option would have been to go out to Central Park and hand out copies of the book and force people to read it or something. But it seemed like the better approach was to use use a television documentary, for example. And there are trade-offs. Do we bring in celebrities, which can risk cheapening issues that we care about, but we'll get in more eyeballs. We opted to bring in the celebrities, and I think it was very much worth the trade-off. We then worked with you and a game, and again, it was a low barrier way of bringing in new people who might not particularly care about the issues initially, but through a non-didactic, fun game, might be exposed to issues and gradually reeled in.
There is something that I remember you guys said when we worked together, and I'm quoting you, obviously. I hope it's correct, still correct.
We hope so too.
Is the idea that you wish that the public sector, that NGOs, that CSR will be good at marketing and selling causes as the people that sell toothpaste, toothbrushes are doing their job. Is it still the case?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that's what we do have a section in the Path of Peers where we talk about how, it used to be that the nonprofits were considered good and noble and that the for-profits were considered evil and greedy. But now there's a huge spectrum. There are a lot of for-profits, a lot of corporations that are doing a lot of good, and a lot of charities that may not be doing so much good. And there's a lot in between. So right now, some of the charities are borrowing from the business using metrics and really milestones and goals. And a lot of the corporations now are trying to do a little bit more good. So it's almost a competition. And frankly, I think the charities have to watch out because these corporations have the power to do a lot of good.
Right.
The problem is that right now, the CSR programs at these corporations are basically, window dressing. They're not very effective. And so until they can actually really rev up, their programs and incorporate it into the business case for their companies, the large corporations have not yet switched on. But there is a huge swath of medium to small size ventures, and new startups that are actually coming up with socially driven for-profit enterprises. And they actually can make a really increasingly large difference.
And in your book, which you're going to sign later on at lunch,
That was a good marketing effort. Thank you.
I mean, I'm not sure it was that subtle, but there's also stories kind of, highlighting and putting to the front a story like Charity Water. Innovation that we didn't see from NGOs 10 years ago, maybe.
Traditionally, NGOs tended to flinch at the idea of marketing something. Oh, that's what lipstick companies do. It is so much more important to market bed nets, to market clean water, to market girls' education than it is to market lipstick. And bravo to groups like Charity Water that have figured out how to use kind of slick marketing to get more people engaged if the result is going to be more lives saved in the field.
Right. So we talked about media a bit. Let's talk about technology. I think that Soraya might be even here. I remember that you were pioneering social media in the New York Times with Soraya, the rabbi.
Soraya was my guru, is my guru.
And I think you also was the first or one of the first to write a blog in the New York Times. And now I see your experiments with the business model, with your own newsletter that is kind of a way for readers to get to the content in different ways. What is driving that exploration? What is your how do you feel technology is going to help journalists?
I think that traditionally, companies that have been leaders in their industries have been so proud of what they've done that they have been not great at innovating and adapting, and hence have faltered when the new technology comes forward. You think of Kodak with digital, or rail companies with auto and this kind of thing.
Britannica, yeah.
Or Encyclopedia Britannica with online databases. And I think that indeed has been true of news organizations. And so I try in my little sandbox to try to do what I can to experiment with reaching new audiences and trying new things and taking risks. And some of these don't work out. I've been playing with Snapchat. I don't think I'm going to become, master of Snapchat to equal my daughter. But I think it's worth taking these experiments, taking risks, and that's kind of what our future depends upon.
Right. So one of those risks and experiments was doing games. I know that. Coming to Games for Change, obviously, 2009 was a statement. And then I think you saw Darfur is Dying, right? There was this story that at that time you reported about Darfur, but then Darfur is Dying came out and kind of got audiences from very different places. A student project done for $50,000 with MTV, and suddenly got awareness to the issue that might not get from even the New York Times.
Right, and Food Force, a generation before that,
right,
as a game that really built an audience for hard issues of food aid.
And then the interesting thing is in 2013, and I think I saw your tweet about it, the number one most popular story in the New York Times is a game. I mean, what did it? How people reacted to this in the New York Times, in your environment?
There is, I think, growing appreciation in the news industry that games are part of the future, that we need to be more experimental. But there is also kind of the burden of our legacy and our tradition and our culture and a tremendous pride in all that we've achieved and a reluctance, understandably, to jeopardize any of that. And so it's a balance that I think, in general, news organizations have, been too slow in trying new things, including games.
I mean, I think it's actually really a tricky balance because you do have to allocate funds. And so you want to make sure that the funds that you're spending, because these are hard-won funds, will actually yield something. At the same time, you do want to experiment. So even if you fail, you want to be able to say that these lessons will actually take us further because of something. And so it is hard for a company to really say, well, we really do want it to be successful. What is the chances for success? Even with failure, the lessons learned, how much is it really going to move the dial?
Right.
Those are hard decisions. And, the question is our games, like for a newspaper, company or media company, how far away from the core are our games? I don't think they're that far in some ways, but you don't want to be taken so far off from the core, away from the core, that not only that it's off mission, but also that it doesn't really enhance the core brand.
Yeah, and that leads me to After Sky. I want to be very transparent and open with our audience and kind of, again, go with this lessons learned and an experiment. First of all, it took us a lot of time together, with all the celebrities, with the platform, with the documentary on the way, to raise the money. We went to foundations that sometimes it was the first time they ever thought about even funding a game. So it took 2-3 years to get it together. And I really wanted you to kind of share maybe, what was your most positive surprise with the games, and what was something that maybe you expected more and you were disappointed.
Well, I think that for me, what surprised me is that the game was very well done. It was extremely well done. It wasn't, their first reaction was, this is such a serious topic and you're going to use a game? Again, it was that sort of that celebrity cheapening idea, which actually I don't think happened at all. And with the game, I don't think it cheapens it at all, because these issues, life is about sorrow, happiness, fun and sadness, and all of the topics that we wrote about in Half the Sky, there was all of that too. It's not all tragic. In fact, in the book, we tried to have hope alongside
inspiring stories.
Exactly, the struggles. And I think that games can provide that as well, and they can draw people in. So I think that was a positive surprise. I think the negative surprise was, I wished it would have reached 50 million people. And so, these are hard things to figure out. What would you have to do to reach 50 million people? If when it scaled it down to make it one of these more addicting games, would that have been the right way?
A shorter experience.
For me, the most pleasant surprise was the degree to which half the game took off in Egypt, in Turkey. I forget the countries that were the
Latin America. With Brazil and which I thought which surprised me, and I thought was really, really important and powerful. I think that maybe the disappointment had to do with the inability. We also had these mobile games to try to encourage people to deworm their children more in India and Africa, and to promote safe childbearing. And I think these are potentially really important because one of the hardest problems in development is to promote behavior change. Yep.
And there are a million approaches to this. None of them have worked very well. A fun mobile game might be a very, very powerful way to change behaviors in remote areas. People don't read newspapers, don't watch television. But the way to really find that out definitively would have been a randomized controlled trial.
Right.
And we couldn't get funding.
And we
to do
tried,
that.
we couldn't get
We tried, and so we think that we think it works at behavior change, but we don't have quite the certainty that we could have had if we'd been able to raise funds for a randomized trial.
By the way, I was just in Kenya recently at the Kibera School, at one of their health clinics, and they actually have the game in the waiting room. It's perfect.
9 minutes, the pregnancy.
No,
Oh.
the actual game, the Facebook game. It's perfect. They've translated into the local languages, but it's perfect because you wait there for hours, and so they have lots of iPads there, and you can just go there and play the game. And there's always a line for the iPads.
That's great. Great
for
to
the
hear.
game, not for the iPads, for the game.
So maybe my last bit before we open to the audience is really what advice or what tip you can give that audience that is probably a diverse audience, mixture of game developers, non-profits, educators, people that come from social responsibility for corporations, but they all have this common interest in making games that can make a difference.
I do think that games can be extremely powerful. I still think they really can be. And there's so many games that are, just full of killing. And it just would be wonderful to see just as many positive games that have a great social message, that are also engaging and fun and can change people's attitudes, because our society really needs a lot of attitudinal change. And so I think games really can play a role. So I do hope that people will continue to persevere in experimenting with games in traditional places.
Two suggestions. One having to do with empathy. I really think that one of the main challenges we face in the country is sort of an empathy gap, getting people to put themselves in the shoes of somebody else and understand them. I think that in many ways that's the root of racial biases, gender biases, all kinds of biases. And how can one address that? I suspect that putting myself in the shoes or avatar of somebody else in the form of a game may be one way to chip away at that kind of empathy gap. And if it's a fun game, that I think that has potentially important social consequences for the country. And the other, has to do with this idea of behavior change. Just one of the really important struggles abroad and at home. And there's some indication that entertainment is very effective at doing that. You think of the teenage pregnancy rate in the U.S., which resisted so many interventions. And there's some indication that 16 and pregnant was a significant factor in reducing the teen pregnancy rate in the U.S. because teenage girls were watching and suddenly realized how burdensome it is to have a baby. Likewise, there was a very well-done study in India that found that when soap operas from the cities arrived in rural areas, that had a dramatic effect in reducing the number of men who were beating up their wives, because they saw that these sort of upper status urban couples, the guy wasn't beating up his girlfriend or wife, and the woman was leaving the home without permission, and it had a real effect on values. So I think there's some indication that things that we think about as entertainment can have important effects in shaping our values and our behaviors, and good luck in pursuing that.
Thank you. Let's say maybe two questions from the audience.
Thank you so much for your work, all of your work. You've done such a wonderful job of making convincing moral arguments for people who aren't usually convinced by moral arguments. And keying on what you've been saying here, both of you, how do you reach 50 million people? How do you get funding for the randomized trial and all these other things about marketing? Last night at your presentation also, I was thinking Dan Pallotta, with his work that he's doing now, I don't know what you think of what he's doing, but where you sit in Rotarian magazine, for example, for the Rotary, is what if Rotary had $150 million to promote one initiative, like they did with polio, the eradication of polio. The other one is Ralph Nader, a few years ago. We had him in the same place last night, talking about his then new book, which was Only the Rich Can Save Us, meaning that's where the funding would come from. So what's your take on this? How can we get to the kind of funding that's needed to do these things that you know so well what to do?
I mean, I think that funders are going to look for this kind of real, solid evidence, and I think the game community is convinced that this will have effect, but that's not enough. One needs real evidence, metrics, and that's beginning to accumulate. And I think that going to a funder and saying, look, you can be the first one to do a good randomized trial to really see, does this work, at what cost? I think that would be a huge benefit to the entire community.
I mean, there's already work being done at the top research universities on gaming and what the impact of gaming at an early age is. And so when those results come out, those will be really powerful to then harness, to use as precisely as possible to create, to go to funders, potential funders, and say, we want to now implement exactly what this randomized controlled trial has shown works to actually change behavior. So I think that's one thing. I do think, I don't know what Dan Pilato was saying last night, but I certainly think that he, we write about him in A Path of Peers. I mean, he's a perfect example of someone who was applying all the right metrics and the right approaches, the business approach to marketing. I think he was just too early for his time. I think that the industry wasn't ready for someone who was just so successful, and there was too much envy. And that is another thing that I think the entire charitable world has to change, because if you want talent in the industry, you really have to pay for talent. And I think too long, and part of this comes from us as a society putting, and particularly donors, putting pressure on these charities. You can't be paid that much. And that's just, that's hurting the cause, because what you want to focus on is outcomes. And so even if someone who wants to demand a high amount of salary, if that person gets the outcomes that you want, then isn't that what it's all about?
One more question, please. Yes.
Hi, I'm Kabi Verzosa, and I'm very pleased to hear about the story of early childhood development work that you're doing. I've worked on early
Here you have a mic, sorry. Here.
I've worked on early childhood development in Africa, so this is great that you're doing this work. My question is maybe for the game developers and for everybody who's into change interventions. One of the challenges is you may be able to raise awareness of a lot of people, and if the call to action is just to be aware, and the behavior change is at the individual level, that's great, but that's only the first step. The question is, how do you sustain reform initiatives? How do you get this early childhood development program to be embraced by the next political administration? How do you get middle managers in the Department of Education, in the Department of, various institutions, because the institutional mechanisms are also important. So one of the things that I was thinking, a lot of the games are developed for the end user. What about games for the middle managers, the games for policymakers, the games, because they're important too. And the empathy gap is even bigger there. Thank you. Just your thoughts. I mean, I was just curious what your thoughts are on these issues.
I tend to think that these kinds of decisions are typically, the leaders tend to be those at the grassroots, and that the, quote-unquote leaders are busily trying to test the winds and then follow whatever they sense grassroots opinion to be. So I think that if one can change grassroots opinion, that is key. And I think that on issues like early childhood education, it's a combination of focusing on evidence and above all building coalitions that become non-polarized. The big mistake in retrospect in K through 12 education reform was that it became so polarized, so toxic, that it became stalemated, and everybody was so busy battling each other. And I say this as somebody who supported the education reform movement and still believes in it by and large, but I think at this point it's so toxic that it's worth trying to redirect some of those energies to the 0 to 5 space. And one of the advantages of that is that it's not polarized. And you have New York City that emerged as a leader of that. You also have Oklahoma and Utah, red states, that have been leaders in it. The one when President Obama talked about early childhood education in his State of the Union address, it was the only thing he said in that address that John Boehner actually applauded. So there is this moment when we may have a certain amount of political space to proceed on this if we're really willing to build broad coalitions.
And then again, the focus is on outcomes, on results. I mean, the reason that Oklahoma is doing this is that it saves money. They don't have to spend so much money later on. That's an outcome. And the reason that New York City, I mean, ultimately is trying to do this is because they need to improve the education trajectory for all of the millions of kids that they have to educate through K through 12. So it really has to do with outcomes, and if we can focus on the outcomes, I just think that it's more easy for people to come to agree to a common approach, rather than make it, obviously, hopefully it will not become politicized.
Great. We're out of time. I want to recommend you guys to stay for the next session, which will be great. But you can meet Nick and Sheryl again during lunch break at the entrance of Skirball. If you didn't bring your own book, you can get it there and get it signed by Nick and Sheryl. So it's in 30 minutes. Okay. So it's going to be 1:15, probably a bit late, 1:30. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.